Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Livestock SA's South Australian Emergency Animal Disease Industry Update and Q&A. My name's Alistair Lawson. I work with Ag Communicators, and it's great to have you all online this evening for what is obviously a very pertinent topic. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar on the lands of the Kaurna people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all viewing from this evening, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. Tonight, you'll be hearing from industry and government on the specific activities in place to safeguard South Australian primary producers and the wider community from an emergency animal disease outbreak. Now, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing in the coming days. We have a packed program this evening, and we thank those who submitted questions upon registration. These questions will get priority in Q&A later, but we'll also be taking questions tonight via the Q&A function. Now, to submit a question, please click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window and enter the question there. Unless there's anything particularly urgent, we'll try and hold all questions until the final Q&A session at the end, as we have about 20 minutes or so set aside for that. We ask that you keep all questions respectful, and we hope to provide you with some useful information this evening. Now, again, any questions we don't get to will be addressed offline, but I'll have more on that later. So kicking off presentations tonight is South Australia's Minister for Primary Industries and Regional Development, the Honourable Claire Scriven MLC. And Minister Scriven was raised in Mount Gambier and returned to the region after living and working in Adelaide for many years. She was previously State Manager of the Australian Forest Products Association and is passionate about the importance of the industry to the South Australian economy. Minister Scriven is committed to regional development, social and economic inclusion, improving educational opportunities and supporting small business. As well as private sector roles in forestry and human resources, she has many years' experience in government policy and service delivery. Tonight, Minister Scriven will outline the state government's response to the emerging threat of emergency animal diseases. Minister, over to you.
Thanks very much, Alistair, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very significant webcast. I think it's incredibly important as an issue, and I want to thank Livestock SA and everyone else who's been involved in organising it. Now, I was pleased to hear that today's PIRSA-led exotic animal disease workshop was a success, and I understand that discussions were really great first step in terms of talking about state-level preparedness for emergency responses. And I want to thank the participants from across industry who contributed to the workshop, including Livestock SA, Pork SA, and the South Australian Dairy Association, because they were all involved in leading that initiative, which is very much appreciated. Now, the biosecurity environment has been shifting in our region for some years, as I imagine most of you who are online would be well aware. But it's become increasingly rapid recently in terms of, first of all, African swine fever and then lumpy skin disease spreading through Southeast Asia. And of course, more recently, Indonesia losing its status as a free from foot and mouth disease. So all of these diseases, of course, are getting closer to our doorsteps and is a huge matter of concern for everyone here in this room, for everyone who's on this webinar, no doubt. Such an important industry is going to be incredibly concerned about those increasing threats. But I think it's also worth remembering that Australia has such a very long history of excellent biosecurity systems. It's served us well for many years. In fact, I've heard it described as unique around the world, and it does continue to adapt to the global threats to ensure that we can protect our agricultural industries and, of course, our way of life that we're used to. And I'm sure that everyone would be aware that the detection of lumpy skin disease and then foot and mouth in Indonesia wasn't the beginning of our preparedness activities. It's simply, I guess, upped the ante somewhat in terms of what we're doing, but also in terms of people's awareness of the threats and what they need to do. I think it is, in some ways, a reminder that we can't take our unique biosecurity status for granted. It's got to be something that we're constantly vigilant about. And, there are constantly threats of possible incursions from our near neighbours and those further afield. We need to be aware of the increased threats, but aware that, of course, these threats have been with us for some time. The South Australian government certainly does understand the risks and the impacts posed by these threats, and we are absolutely committed to doing everything that we can in terms of helping both the Commonwealth Government and industry for all of us to work together so that here in South Australia, but across our nation, we remain free from these damaging exotic diseases. Now, PIRSA has got a long-running and well-supported disease surveillance and exotic animal disease preparedness system, and it's focused on detecting the diseases quickly and readying the agency to implement a fast and effective eradication response. I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone here that the swiftness of response is absolutely crucial. Now, as a government, we're also trying to take a bipartisan approach to this. I think the issues that we're talking about have such incredible importance for the agricultural industry, but also for our communities at large, that really we want to make sure that they are above politics. And we want to be as united as possible in the Parliament in terms of supporting the agricultural industry. So to that end, my department has briefed the Shadow Minister for Primary Industries on the current foot and mouth disease in Indonesia and the readiness that we have in place if there were to be an incursion. And tomorrow I'm hosting a briefing for all regional members of Parliament from PIRSA officials. I think it's a really fine balance that we need to get right. And this is certainly what industry has been telling me, that we need to make sure that people are aware of the risks and the threats so that they do the right thing, particularly people travelling in from Indonesia, for example, and other countries, particularly people who might be, for example, bringing in food, not thinking of themselves as importers, yet their family sending them a snack pack, that sort of thing. We need people to be aware of how damaging that can be. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that we don't have sensationalist reporting from the media, because that can negatively impact our trading partners, and that's not going to be good for industry either. So I think it's incredibly important that we try and strike that right balance between the public awareness, but also not overstating where we're at, because we don't have foot and mouth disease in Australia. I was asked on media today, how many incursions are there in South Australia now? The journalist wasn't even aware that we don't have it here. So I think it's really important that we raise awareness, but not take it too far in terms of members of the public panicking. PIRSA has also been very active in briefing across state government departments, including Cabinet and all the relevant government committees that would be involved in a response, and their necessary preparation for the future in case there's an incursion. As I said, and hopefully everyone knows here, there's no current, we don't currently have disease in the country. I've also spoken with the agricultural ministers from across the country, and also my federal counterpart, on the national actions that are being undertaken to improve our border controls in response to the heightened risk that we're looking at the moment. And we've seen action at Adelaide Airport international arrivals. That includes the installation of sanitation mats on arrival and increased screening of passengers on flights from Indonesia, and the detection of illegal meat products that a passenger was carrying, which I'm sure many of you would have heard about, shows that the measures, one, they're necessary, there's probably no argument about that, but secondly, that they are working. So the surveillance that's in place is working. And the Australian government also used federal powers for the first time at Adelaide Airport to give additional powers to their biosecurity officers to further enhance their ability to detect non-compliance. Senior PIRSA officers are active participants in the Exotic Animal Disease Task Force, which began with preparedness for an incursion of lumpy skin disease, but now, of course, includes foot and mouth disease as well. There are a number of other actions underway at a state level that will boost both the government and industry preparedness for such a response, and of course today's workshop is part of that, and our Chief Veterinary Officer Mary Carr will speak further about those other actions. I do want to thank again Livestock SA for providing this opportunity to speak with you all tonight, and I look forward to hearing your questions and concerns, and especially look forward to continuing what so far has been, I think, an excellent partnership between Commonwealth Government, state government and industry. So I'm very keen that that close work continues, because that partnership approach, I think, is the way that we will make sure that we do keep foot and mouth disease out of our country, and we do have preparedness if the worst was to ever occur. Thanks.
Many thanks, Minister Scriven, for bringing us all up to date on the state government's response. Really appreciate that. As mentioned earlier, we'll keep rolling through the presenters now, and we'll try and save questions for later on. Don't forget to pop them in the Q&A box if you haven't submitted one already. Now I'd like to introduce Travis Tobin, Now, Travis was appointed as Livestock SA CEO in March 2022. Having spent his career in various senior management roles across the private, government and not-for-profit sectors, Travis brings strong leadership, strategic, operational, policy and governance experience. He also has considerable experience in change management and organisational reform. Now, tonight, Travis will bring us up to date on the current situation with emergency animal diseases and outline what Livestock SA and its fellow state farming organisations are doing, as well as what they are responsible for in regard to emergency animal disease preparedness. Travis, over to you.
Thanks, Alistair. Good afternoon or evening, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Just before I dive into where are we at with some things, I just thought just highlight one of the reasons we wanted to do this webinar. You know, we're not trying to replicate the national webinar on the 20th of July. There's going to be another one, national webinar next Tuesday, and that's going to move to a monthly scheduling anyway. But it's really just to try and add another level to the understanding about what's going on and maybe some more tangible things that you can do. We're seeking your feedback. There's a lot of information out there and some of it's pretty unreliable. So we're trying to keep members and the broader industry up to date with what's important. So we've done several member updates so far. We've got a dedicated EAD page. We started that a few weeks ago. You know, we'll add to that. So we're sort of through this, we're hoping to get what you're missing. So what are you missing? What do you want to know? What are the additional things that you want at your fingertips? And we can update that on the website. So we use the webinars a bit to help us inform a Q&A document because, you know, they're the things that you're telling us you want to know rather than us saying what you should know. So where are we up to briefly? Collectively, I think it needs to be acknowledged there's been a massive amount of work by government and industry behind the scenes since March, as the Minister mentioned, since lumpy skin disease was first detected in Indonesia. So really good collaboration, industry and government, all levels. Nationally, FMD, so you know, we've seen the Australian government activities pre-border and at the border ratchet up in line with the increased risk. So Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry is obviously responsible for pre and at border biosecurity. He's been working closely with the national industry bodies on these arrangements. Some of the pre-border things, again, I won't go through them all in detail because they're on those other webinars, which we've socialised heavily and will continue to do so. But pre-border, you know, they're investing in Indonesia, 1 million vaccines donated, 5 million in technical support to assist Indonesia try and get it under control. MLA is also investing, you know, $500,000 in feedlot sector capacity. So pre-barley, there was enhanced surveillance, targeted testing, and increased awareness for travellers. Post-barley, there was 18 new biosecurity officers, 2 additional detector dogs in Darwin and Cairns, enhanced profiling of travellers, social media campaigns, biosecurity messages, those sorts of things. And as the Minister mentioned, you know, foot mat sanitisation is the latest thing. So federal government, 14 million to date in increased investment. And I think what we're seeing now is the promotion of cases where they're demonstrating the system's working. So the $2,600 hamburger was the most recent one. So national level lumpy skin disease. So DAF stood up a LSD FMD preparedness task force led by Dr. Chris Parker, and you've probably seen him on numerous things now. We're going to get Chris on again tonight, but you know he'll actually be a guest speaker at the RMC breakfast at this Adelaide show. So we'll be talking about it in person here soon anyway. So you know, so then what has been done out of that, which again started back in March, was a draft national LSD action plan with 8 objectives, sort of looking at cattle specifically, obviously, but what are the things that need to be strengthened or established? So they've been running those workshops and they've only got one more to go to finalise that plan. So that's happening as well. And then if we think about national level, what's industry doing? So there's various task forces and working groups that are convened by the Red Meat Advisory Council and the National Farmers Federation, so AMAC and NFF. And that's comprising of the various peak industry bodies, some state bodies, RDCs and relevant state and federal reps. So they're meeting regularly to look at activities not covered by AusVet plan and in the draft lumpy skin disease action plan that's also being done. So that task force met 13 times already, and they've also including FMD with LST now. So I've got 5 working groups under that to cover all bases. At a state level, again, the Minister mentioned it earlier, and Mary may talk a bit more about it after. So we're having ongoing discussions all the time across the livestock industry bodies, PIRSA and with the Minister's office. The collaboration is really good, open discussions about how the situation is evolving and what we should be doing in response at a state level. So again, as the Minister alluded to, we had a first scenario testing exercise today for an exotic animal disease. We had over 30 representatives from across the supply chain, and that was covering red meat, wool, dairy and pork. So it was a really good day. Sort of asked to talk about what is the role of industry in this. So industry has a critical role supporting, not leading, but supporting the preparedness and response activities. And in that, there's some long-standing structures in place that ensure, the link between strategic and operational functions happen, and there's a recognised mechanism there for sign-off of national agreements and cost sharing when it's need to be enacted. So the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, which I'm sure Sam will talk a bit more about, that's a legally binding contractual agreement between the Commonwealth, state and territory governments and the livestock industries that at a national level to increase that preparedness and response. So from a Livestock SA perspective, we're a member and have representatives on 4 of the peak industry bodies that are signatories to the ADRA. So that's Cattle Council of Australia, Sheep Producers Australia, Wool Producers Australia and the Goat Industry Council of Australia. So that's sort of how that all ties in. And those peak bodies have certain responsibilities in the event of an EAD. Should stop using acronyms, shouldn't I? Emergency animal disease, and they're on various decision-making groups. So that's where industry fits in. They also will play a key role in the liaison side of things, and those similar responsibilities will fall to organisations like Livestock SA at the state level. So I guess from a bit of a plug here, but if you're not already a member of Livestock SA, consider signing up so we can actually better communicate with you. We're trying to do the right thing and getting the messaging out, but we can't communicate with you if we don't have your details. So just in closing, I think it's important to note too, we've been in the preparedness phase for FMD for many years. Lumpy skin disease, less so, but yes, while the risk is increasing following detection in Indonesia, and government expert biosecurity panel has put those numbers now at about 12% for FMD and 28% for LSD of an outbreak within the next 5 years. But that doesn't mean, it's a certainty that we will have an incursion of either of those diseases. So I think take some comfort from the levies that you pay. So you've been investing in biosecurity structures, agreed plans, processes that are strong. They've been in place for over 20 years, and we've successfully kept FMD out of the country for 150 years. So, but also, we don't operate in an environment of zero risk. So, make sure your farm border is as secure as possible. Your boundary fence, and what you do inside that fence is your last line of defence. So protecting your animals and your livelihood. And Penny will probably talk a bit more about that, I'd say. So I'll leave it there, Alistair, and look forward to finding out what's on people's minds. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Travis. And just on that as well, quick reminder to everyone who's joined tonight to, if you've got any questions, to pop them in the Q&A function below, and we'll get to them later on. So next up tonight, we have Dr. Samantha Allen, who's General Manager, Emergency Preparedness, Animal Health and Biosecurity at Animal Health Australia. Now, Dr. Allen is a senior veterinarian and leader with extensive experience in managing complex biosecurity programs and leading animal disease emergency preparedness and response activities. She's worked in government veterinary roles as well as rural clinical practice in New South Wales and South Yorkshire in England. Samantha has expertise in strategic thinking, policy development, stakeholder engagement and problem solving, underpinned by a strong clinical and technical background in veterinary science. Dr. Allen will present this evening on what Animal Health Australia is responsible for when it comes to emergency animal disease preparedness, and also what an EAD response would look like in South Australia from an Animal Health Australia perspective. Dr. Allen, the floor, or the screen as such, is yours.
Thanks, Alistair. I really just wanted to start off by giving a short introduction about Animal Health Australia. I hope everybody's heard of us, but just in case you're not familiar, Animal Health Australia is a national animal health body, and our role is to manage and coordinate a range of important national animal health programs in the emergency animal disease preparedness space, but also in surveillance, biosecurity and training areas as well. So some of the key things that we do that are of interest in emergency response preparedness are managing the Emergency Disease Response Agreement, or the EADRA. We also look after the AUSVET plans, which are the technical resources that support emergency response. We do a lot of work delivering training and exercises to government and industry. And we also manage vaccine banks, including the foot and mouth disease vaccine bank. Could we just jump ahead to the next slide, please, Belinda? Okay, so just briefly about the EADRA, you've heard that mentioned already a couple of times tonight. It's the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, and it's a cost-sharing agreement between the industries and governments. It also contains the decision-making framework for how a response will be managed, and it's all been pre-agreed by the governments and the industries in peacetime. It sets out how decisions are made and how the costs will be shared between the governments and the affected industries. Could I have the next slide, Belinda? Great. The EADRA is supported by the AUSVET plan suite of resources, and I really hope everyone has heard of AUSVET plan. If you want to go and have a look at what is there, you could scan the QR code on the screen there. They're all public documents. There's a lot there. And as I said, if you're interested, please feel free to go and have a little look at what we've got. So the AUSVET plan resources, they contain the response strategies for 66 emergency diseases. So foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease are 2 of them. And we've also got operational manuals, enterprise manuals, and lots of supporting documents that provide all the information that's needed for Australia to be able to stand up an effective emergency response. So could I have the next slide, please, Belinda? So I just wanted to show this slide to reassure everybody that we have really robust plans in place that have actually been used in real emergency situations, most recently in Victoria in 2020 for the avian influenza outbreak. But we used the same response plans for equine influenza back in 2007, which I'm sure everybody remembers that one. It was a very large response that was over multiple states and took, I think, nearly 9 months for us to get on top of and eradicate. So I know the flowchart is probably too small for people to be able to read, but it shows you that we have a really defined and robust process that we follow that's been successfully used in the past. If I could have the next slide, Belinda. Great. So this one just shows you how AUSVET plan is used during the response. So it'd all start off with the report of unusual signs. So that might be the owner of the livestock, or it might be their vet. Will notify the state chief veterinary officer. So in South Australia, that's Mary Carr. So once Mary hears about it, her team will then start an investigation. And if they believe that there's a strong suspicion of an emergency disease, Mary will inform the Australian chief veterinary officer. And it's the Australian Chief Vet's job to then stand up the Consultative Committee on Emergency Animal Disease, or we call that the CCEAD. And that's a technical committee. It's got all of the chief vets. It's also got industry representatives on it. And they confirm the diagnosis, and then they agree on what the response is going to look like. And that'll be based on AUSVET plan. So while all that is happening, Mary and her team will be really busy writing a disease response plan, which we call the EADRP. And they'll base that on AUSVET plan. It goes to the consultative committee for endorsement, and then it goes up to the next higher level committee, which is called the National Management Group. And that's very senior people from government and industry who are able to actually commit the funding for the response and allows the wheels to start turning. So the big advantage of having all of this agreed now in peacetime is that it means we can move really fast. We aim to have the response plan, the first one, done within 24 hours. And then the National Management Group will probably meet within hours of that. So really within less than 2 days, we can be up and running with a approved budget and approved national plan. So it's unique in the world, and it's something that we should be really proud of. Could I just have the next slide, please, Belinda? Okay, so I've put this one in because I know we're talking to an industry group tonight, and there's always a lot of interest in what's the role of industry in a response. So I'm talking here about the control centres, so not about, you know, people having good biosecurity and that sort of thing on their farms, but within the control centre context, there is a specific role for industry people, and it's called the Livestock Liaison Industry role. And basically the job is to be the official conduit between the machinery of the response and industry. So it's got a specific role set out in AusVet plan, and there is actually a job card for it, which is very clear. Could I just have the next slide, please, Belinda? So just to, I suppose, make it clear, Livestock Liaison Industry function, which is the grey one on the left, that is appointed by industry, and their role is to be like the official voice of industry within the response. It focuses on how industry's expertise can be best utilised to support the response. And some examples of that would be communicating industry's position on the policies, strategies and plans in the response, providing information on the industry, like specific detail on the composition of the industry in a region or how it operates, to really assist the planning and operations functions within the response. They're also helpful in identifying and sharing resources, so supporting the logistics function of the response and providing insights as well, which can help the recovery process to get started and to be efficient. I've got the note there about the specialist advice function, just because sometimes people get those confused. The specialist advice is a contracted role. It could be a government person, it could be a private person, and they provide technical advice directly into the response. So it's a different role. The Livestock Liaison Industry one, if people are wondering how you become eligible to do that role, you need to be nominated by your peak industry council. And then we roll out training on a jurisdictional basis. So we do it state by state, usually in conjunction with the government biosecurity agency, and it's with support from Animal Health Australia. So we're doing, the next one that we're doing is in Queensland in the next few weeks, and we're talking with all of the jurisdictions about organising times to be able to do extra training in the specific jurisdictions. So if I could have the next slide, please, Belinda. So I did just touch on the LLI training, but if people are interested, there is an EAD foundation course that you can access through the Animal Health Australia website, and that just gives you the basic information about how does the response work, what's the framework behind it, how is it organised, how decisions are made. So if anybody is interested, from the Animal Health Australia website, you can find that, and perhaps if there are resources circulated after the webinar, we can provide a link to be shared with participants as well. So the other core training that we do is to train the people that go to those committees that I mentioned, the CCEAD and the NMG. And we also do exercises which we run with governments. Sometimes we do them directly with industry. There is a group called the National Biosecurity Response Team, which is their government employees. They go across all sorts of all hazards. So they do natural disasters, they do plant responses, and animal and aquatic. So we support them with training and mentoring. And then we also have just-in-time resources as well. So just say you were trained for Livestock Liaison Industry, but it was 5 years ago. If we had a response next week and you were asked to attend, we've got this just-in-time training as well, just to bring people back up to speed if they're feeling a little bit rusty or a bit nervous about being involved in a response. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, all right, so I guess I just wanted to finish off then with some current activities that Animal Health Australia are focusing on. We're really sort of operating at that national level. So we're working hard at the moment on the review of the AusVet plans, both the foot and mouth disease one and the lumpy skin disease one. They are, the current manuals that are approved and on our website are technically very sound and still good, but they're under a review process at the moment because of the increased risk, and just to make sure that they've got the most accurate information available. The lumpy skin disease one, we've got the interim final draft on the website now and hope to have that finalised within the next few weeks. The foot and mouth disease one is a little bit more complicated, but we're very close to having a revised manual published as well. I think that one might be a couple of months away. And if it gives you some reassurance, Mary and her team have been very involved in the development of those, as well as the peak industry councils as well. Just as well, I wanted to mention that we've had an exercise of the lumpy skin disease manual. We did that just with the expert writing group as part of the development process. We do also have plans in place to test the new manuals once they're finalised, so that'll be coming up probably towards the end of the year. A recent exercise that we did was exercise Argonaut with the wool industry in October 2020, and there were some recommendations coming out of that, which we're working to finalise with the wool industry. And the other thing that's been very important that we've been doing was just testing the vaccine bank arrangements. Animal Health Australia manages the foot and mouth disease vaccine bank. And so we have got procedures in place for the ordering, the transport of the vaccine to get here. We have a bank of the equipment which needs to be used to actually deliver the vaccine into the animal. So we've tested all of that to make sure that it's ready to go. If we needed to push the button on a Sunday afternoon, I feel very confident that that's all ready to go. So the only other thing I wanted to mention was we do have a new AHA disease alert update function that we're providing, and if people want to sign up for that, you can scan the QR code and put your name on the list and you'll get those updates as they come. So, thanks, Alistair.
Many thanks, Dr. Allen, and I guess on behalf of Livestock SA, to you and to Minister Scriven and Dr. Carr, I really thank you all for joining tonight and for hanging around for Q&A later on, which we'll get to in about 15 minutes time. So thanks again. So before moving on, I guess, we've got our penultimate speaker now, South Australia's Chief Veterinary Officer, Dr. Mary Carr. Now, Dr. Carr was appointed Chief Veterinary Officer in December 2018. She was previously a veterinary officer with PIRSA Biosecurity SA Animal Health since 2008. Dr. Carr completed a Master's in Veterinary Public Health Management through Sydney University in 2012 and became a member by examination of the Epidemiology chapter of the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists in 2015. She provides a strategic leadership role in the Biosecurity Animal Health Department. So tonight, Dr. Carr will provide an overview of PIRSA's biosecurity response and talk around what producers can expect in the event of an emergency animal disease outbreak. Dr. Carr, over to you.
Thank you. Excellent. Just leave it on that slide for now. So I just wanted to open this session that I'll give just to talk a little bit about all the diseases that we're currently dealing with. While foot and mouth disease often is the one that the media attention is focused on, we are very aware of the other diseases that are just to the north of us. Foot and mouth disease has been in Southeast Asian countries for quite a period of time now. Yes, Indonesia has lost its free status, but those diseases have been in the Southeast Asian region for a while. What has been newer to the scene is lumpy skin disease. And we do have concerns around lumpy skin disease due to the uncontrolled pathway through insects that may come through weather events. And we've also got African swine fever that's moved quite quickly through that region over the last 4 or so years. And that's moved right across, we've seen it in Timor-Leste and across into other countries that are closer to Australia as well, which brings its own risks. So really wanted to stress that we are preparing for a number of these diseases, but our disease activity that we do, the preparedness that we do, it's applicable for everything. And as we've seen with Japanese encephalitis, sometimes it's not the disease we're expecting is the one we have to deal with. But the work that we put in now, the efforts that are made by industry for preparedness, they are transferable and they do help us manage with those, and the relationships we build through our preparedness activities put us in the right place to be able to have the conversations about a totally different disease when it does happen. Next slide, thank you.
So there's a couple of key areas that PIRSA really focuses its attention on. And one of those is actually prevention of an outbreak. So we are looking at trying to prevent the transmission. If it happens to come through the border, which we hope is not the case, but the fact is that nothing is going to be absolutely 100% foolproof. There will be people that undertake illegal activities, and we consider this prevention of transmission the second layer of defence. It's just an extra layer that we put there to protect our industries. So things like the prohibited pig feed ban, which some people may know as swill feeding, the ban on that, and the ruminant feed ban legislations are there to actually break that transmission cycle. Swill feeding is known as, which is the feeding of non-rendered meat and products or waste products that have come into contact with meat, feeding that to pigs. It's actually one of the highest risk activities for the introduction of disease into a new environment, and has been blamed for the UK 2001 outbreak, that there was a swill feeding activity. The other one is the movement of live animals is a really real risk for the transmission of these diseases, like foot and mouth disease. And luckily, Australia, we've got those great border controls in there, but that is thought to be the reason that FMD, the breakdown occurred in Indonesia, was live animals being moved into to Indonesia from other Southeast Asian countries. So we've got those things, that second layer of protection there. The other thing that we see as a second layer of protection is actually good biosecurity. Good biosecurity prevents outbreaks from occurring. If you don't get the transmission, even if a virus gets into the country, if you don't get it actually coming into contact with an animal, then you've got that break in the cycle, in the transmission cycle. So clean clothes and shoes, all these things you'll be, like at the border, you can have your own little country as a property, risk assessing your visitors. And the other one that we really like to put to the community as well is around making sure that people get permission before entering properties, handling or feeding animals, those aspects as well. So part of our role is working with industry to make sure we are getting those messages out there. Next slide, please. The next real focus that we have is actually reducing the size of the outbreak. If we can't prevent it with the activities we've got there, then we want to be in the best position we can to make this as small as possible. And the keys to making a disease event small are early detection. So the less chance for spread, the smaller outbreak, the sooner we can get our free status back, and the sooner we can go back to as normal as possible. So there's a couple of key things we do in that area. One is increasing the communication. Reporting of that disease to us is key to us taking activity early. If you don't have the 1800 675 888 phone number in your phone, take the 2 seconds while I'm talking now to punch it in. That gets you through. When you ring that, you go through, it will give you a switchboard situation. You choose South Australia. It puts you in contact with one of my staff members. So you can talk to them about what you're seeing, and the earlier we get on to doing something about it, the better off for everyone. The other thing that we do is we like to increase our level of testing. And we know that with foot and mouth disease in particular, the signs may be very subtle in sheep and goats. And it's been known to be a cause of quite widespread movement of the disease, because people don't realise that what is presented as a mild lameness could actually be foot and mouth disease. So we like to test a lot. And what we do is where we've got a very low suspicion of disease, we call it clinically consistent, and we do not put quarantines on those properties. So the impacts to the producer are not there if we don't actually think you've got foot and mouth disease. If I think you've got foot and mouth disease, you'll get quarantined immediately. But we do a lot of these rule outs day in, day out. And my philosophy on this is that I would prefer to be 3 days late with putting that quarantine on than 3 weeks or 3 months late and it's been spreading around, because that will be an absolute disaster. So lots of testing, but we only put those quarantines onto properties if we have got a high level of suspicion. And look, we've done another one this week. We are regularly doing these. The more we do, the better chance we have of picking it up early. The other thing we do is, once again, biosecurity practices. The more we can be clean to property, isolation periods, having good traceability actually allows us to trace things really quickly and actually lock things down and allow the rest of the industry to continue moving. And the other thing that is really important, I think, around those biosecurity practices is being prepared to hold your animals. Having facilities and space, be able to hold those if we need to put a standstill on. If you look at your animals and you think, oh, maybe they're off today, err on the side of caution and don't send them on the truck. You know, only healthy animals should ever be moved. So some really key things. The other one is regular monitoring. If you're looking at your animals, your neighbours' animals, and you know, over the fence, and being really aware, the sooner you can see that, then the sooner you'll know to report. So the other aspect that we have around biosecurity is we do have the One Biosecurity program. It's an online application that actually helps you work through your biosecurity practices, provides you with some feedback, and will give you a rating as where you are in the biosecurity spectrum for industry. So the other area that is our key area of responsibility is actually being prepared to respond. They've already spoken a lot about the national arrangements that are in place, and we spend put a lot of effort into those national arrangements, and that's because we want national consistency. We want to be able to roll out a response, and the reality is it will possibly be in more than one jurisdiction at the same time when we get one of these diseases. So we want to be able to make sure that we have got a well-oiled machine, that what is happening is consistent, because we know that inconsistency will create confusion and hamper our efforts around a response. We're also very active in our state level arrangements. So as we have already mentioned, we've been working with the pig industry because of our African swine fever preparedness, and also our Japanese encephalitis response. All of that work has put us in a really good position moving forward for other emergency diseases. Today we had our kick-off meeting with the red meat and dairy industry around emergency preparedness. There were some key themes that came out of that, which we will be continuing to work with industry on, around how can we make sure that our communication early in a response is key. We need to be able to get very clear, consistent messages out that industry will understand. So there's a body of work I can see there going forward. There's also making sure we have the right industry representatives, not just at the table, but understanding their role and being able to actively participate in these emergency responses. And then the final one was really around making sure we've had a bit of a further dive into some of the operational planning that we will need industry to work with us on to make it successful. The one thing I can say about today's meeting that we have, that you have an amazingly dedicated and supportive industry that are there working on this stuff with us. It's really heartening. The relationships and working together are what make a response manageable. It really is absolutely critical that we have those good working relationships. And I can see from the dedication in that room today that we will be fine in that respect. The industries across the board worked beautifully together, and the end result, I think, will be put us in a really good stead. The final area that we also work on is through a lot of these other areas, things like the agricultural shows, the zoos, the ag schools, and also the private vets are key areas that sometimes may feel like they slip through the loops a bit, but we've been actively working with all of those groups as well on our preparedness. We're also looking at our whole of state emergency management arrangements, how we're going to use those in the need of escalation. And we're also within our teams, our regional staff have been working on some of the regional industry preparedness, which is really key. Managing responses, if we can work and get regional intel that actually makes a much better response, it will be much more effective. And what we're also doing is looking at, once again, operationalising AusVet plan. So it's taking policy and actually looking at what's the actual logistics of doing that, how are we going to do it, having those plans ready to roll out. The other key area that we are spending a time on is around the laboratory diagnostics as well, making sure we've got the testing capability here in South Australia to get those rapid response results back. The next slide. Thank you. Now, obviously, you're going to notice that this is exactly the same slide as what Sam showed before, and that's because we actually do use these in each state. The response that we do is consistent. So I'm not expecting you to be able to see that, but what I want you to be able to know is that you can go and find that on the Animal Health Australia website. It's really worthwhile knowing exactly what will happen. It's a really simple diagram. But basically, as soon as we get a high suspicion of foot and mouth disease or one of these other diseases, the property is immediately quarantined, which means there is no movements on or off. If people need to come on or off, there will be decontamination facilities at a point that will allow us to get people safely on and off. We will be immediately undertaking high risk, looking for the high risk traces from there. And those properties, if there has been high risk movements, they will be immediately put under quarantine. Now, this is before I've even got, if I've got really genuine suspicions, this is before I've got a lab result back. These things, what we're doing, it happens, and we don't wait for some national agreement to say we've got the funding for it. We respond to what we've got right in front of us at the time. It's always comforting to have the response agreement, but we'll be following what's in AusVet plan, and we'll be doing that. We won't be waiting for funding to be assured. So, so during this time, I'm also reporting this up to the Australian CVO, and normally the situation is I will let him know before we have any results back as well. I get on the phone, I ring him up and I say, look, I've got some concerns. I'll also let the Chief Veterinary Officer of Victoria know, because the samples will have to go across to Geelong to be tested, and we have agreements to let them know that we might be sending in some material. Before and while all this is at the same time is happening, I'll be starting to set up an incident management team. When I have a strong suspicion of disease, or if there's a strong suspicion of disease interstate, we immediately set those teams up. And industry are included in that. They are there from the start to help guide and to provide their technical expertise around what happens within their industry. And so for a disease like foot and mouth disease, that's each species affected will be in the room and able to have those conversations with us. From there, as we said, with the response plan that we're doing, but the initial steps in that for foot and mouth disease is there will be a livestock standstill. So stopping the movements of animals. And the key point of that livestock standstill is it gives us the opportunity to find out where the disease is. And then the idea is that we can then lock those areas down and allow as much normal movement as we possibly can. During this period as well, we'll also be looking for increasing our surveillance and our tracing, where if we do happen to find infected properties within South Australia, there will be restricted areas and control areas put around that. The purpose of those areas are to, once again, try and lock down where the infection sits. It's a pretty busy time, as you can see, and the escalation of resources is there, and we will be needing industry assistance to do a lot of these activities. So once we have got a confirmed diagnosis back, we'll be on the infected property. There is valuation done, destruction of the animals, and then the disposal and decontamination. There are manuals that are available you can go and look at with AusVet plan around how those things happen, but it is tailored to the individual situation that we are dealing with. And we've got risk appreciation and risk decision matrices that we go through to work out what is the best option. There is also, on those infected properties, support for the producers. We have people that can come in and actually talk to them about the mental health effects of, or the situation that they're in, and also for those, the wider community there as well. We know that these diseases, we are dealing with a disaster situation. There are human and social impacts that come with them as well, and they are addressed through the response and the wider response that we do across the state. The final thing we may look at is whether vaccination occurs or not. So there is a vaccine bank for foot and mouth disease. It's possibly around a week to get that actually taken from its. First of all, we've got to identify which is the serotype that we have, and then we need to match the serotype with one that we've got in our vaccine bank, and then they produce it into a vaccine that's actually ready to inject into an animal. And it's thought that it could be as short as a week that vaccine is available. How we use that vaccine is actually decided through the CCAD technical committee, because it may be that there will be competition between different areas as to where that limited amount of vaccine is first used. But from there, that idea of that vaccine bank is to get us through the first month of vaccination, and by then we should be able to get greater production of vaccine. The use of vaccine is a decision that will need to be made on the situation that we're dealing with. If it is a very small, if we were lucky enough to find it on the first property that had occurred and we could really lock that down, we may not need to go to using vaccine, and we may be better off not to use vaccine, because it means we can get back into our markets and our vaccine-free markets earlier. But if there is spread of it, it is likely that we will go to vaccine quite early if we're concerned that it is quite widespread. The other thing that I do like to point out to producers when I'm talking to them about what will happen within an emergency response is that due to the loss of international markets, I'll be putting movement restrictions in place because of for the purpose of trying to control disease. But there may also be movement impacts just purely from the fact that we've lost those markets and there is no longer a need to move animals because there is no market for them to go to. So there will be impacts that occur not because of my restrictions, but just because you're going to need to hold the animals on the property longer than you normally would, because they may not actually be able, the processors may not be in a situation to process them at that point in time. Or people may have decided they don't need to buy more animals at that point in time because of the disease outbreak we're dealing with. So just being aware that not all of the livestock movements and the fact that animals won't be moving is going to be from my movement controls. It may actually be relating to the fact that the whole impact to the market. As far as how long a livestock standstill will stay on for is a decision that we make through the response. What I like to be able to see is that we have determined that we know where the disease is before we lift that livestock standstill. So once again, if we're really quick and onto it, if we get it in the first situation, if we know that we've locked it down onto a few properties, that livestock standstill will be shorter. If it has spread quite widely, it may need to stay in place, possibly a week, even longer. And then it will be a reduction from there, depending on the situation we're dealing with. There may still be a level of movement permit to ensure that we have got good controls and just in case we have missed something with our surveillance or something else pops up. But normally it's a minimum 3 days, but certainly could be a week. We do recommend that all producers have the ability to hold animals for 2 weeks, and that they have feed and fodder supplies, things to support animals for that period of time.
Just another minute or so, Dr. Carr.
I've finished.
Oh, great. Good timing. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. Very informative as usual, and I'm sure all our participants got a lot out of that. Now, I'll quickly move on to Penny Cairns from Livestock SA. Now, Penny is Livestock SA's Senior Project Officer. She joined Livestock SA in 2020 to deliver the Biosecurity Extension Project funded by PIRS's Red Meat and Wool Growth Program. She's since taken on the role of Project Manager. Now, Penny's got extensive industry experience in sheep, cattle and dairy enterprises with a background in agricultural science and agribusiness. Tonight, Penny's going to give us an overview of what best practice farm biosecurity looks like, as well as the resources available to help producers with on-farm biosecurity. Penny, over to you.
Thanks, Alistair. And I also want to thank Ag Communicators for today's excellent running of this webinar for Livestock SA. So thank you. I firstly want to just say, we're going to go through some practical tips for on-farm biosecurity. And it's really about focusing on what within your business as a producer you can control. And so that is your biosecurity. At the end of the day, there's all of these concerns and worries going on, and we've talked about it, and I can just reiterate what Mary said around how we've got a great industry and government working partnership to do all of the other things. But for a producer, what you can focus on is your own on-farm biosecurity. So really now is the time, and the best time to be looking at your biosecurity plan. It's got to be thorough and well thought through, because that's your best line of defense, and yeah, and keeping that in mind. So where's my notes? Sorry. So today, I just want to go through some five of the key tips that we have around biosecurity that will probably not go into a huge amount of depth, because it is a short amount of time that we've got here today. But I do want to just remind people that it's within your control, so you can do it. And the practices you put onto your property right now and you put into your property will pay in dividends long term, regardless of if we have a FMD or an LSD outbreak here in Australia or in South Australia. These practices are actually going to protect you from other diseases, the endemic diseases that we commonly see, you know, foot rot, lice, all of those things, and the pests and weeds. So having these practices in place and just making them a part of your everyday business is really critical. So the first one, and I'll get you to change the slide there for me. So these are my 5 top tips. So really being aware and knowing the risks. So be familiar with what animal disease risks there are present in your region, and how to manage a disease incursion that might be occurring on your property. So it's that risk assessment. No, it's going to be different for each business, and it's really up to you to have a look at where those things are coming in, and really being able to fill those gaps so that those issues don't become a larger problem further down the track. So for some people, that might be that as trading animals and moving a lot of livestock in and out, that quarantining period and news livestock, and really having that protocol in place. Or even with rams, I think anyone bringing any livestock onto property need to be considering that quarantine period, and what that means for your farm, but also your neighbours. So if there's strays and things coming through fences, you've also got to be really onto that and hot on that. The second point is have a plan. So for producers to have a biosecurity plan is one thing. It meets your LPA requirements, your livestock production assurance requirements, but if it's not something that you're actively referring to and using every day, and you haven't put those priorities in place, and you haven't got those things to manage and mitigate risk on your farm, you're really going to probably pay for it in the long run, because you're not planning ahead to manage these things. So it really is that foundation plan for when things really do hit, when you hit adversity or bushfire, drought, but we're now looking at some of these bigger emergency animal diseases. This is the plan that you can go back to and say, look, this is what I've been doing. Mary mentioned it earlier. She said about the One Biosecurity Plan. That's a great portal for people to be using, but there's other plans. The point of it is to have a plan, and have a plan that is actually something that you really use and go back to. Keeping records is the third one. So keep records to be able to maintain your accurate animal health treatments. Livestock and people movements are also really important, and I think Mary said that as well earlier about traceability. Traceability is going to be so important. So if we have the systems in place, the things that we're doing all the time in any animal transfer, your NVDs, take some time on these things and get them right. If you don't understand the NLAS database, go to the integrity systems companies or talk to the PIRSA staff to find out how to use these tools, because they're going to be so important. And they are important all the time, not just in in an animal health, emergency animal disease. So really, yeah, people movements and making sure that you're keeping track of who's coming in. Coming clean, staying clean and going clean. I think that this is really important, and we learned a lot from COVID around people's, where you're letting people go onto your property, but also hygiene. Hygiene is so important, and being able to make sure that you've got designated parking spots for visitors, making sure that if you've got your agronomist or consultant coming onto your property, don't take their vehicle that might have been over a number of properties. Take your own vehicle and you drive, so that you know what you're bringing and introducing onto your property. Sure, there will be contractors and things, but having these plans in place means that you're more prepared to talk to them about it, and have those conversations with contractors, and gate signs are really important as well. Finally, the last one that I want to talk about is look, check, ask a vet, and Mary has touched on it earlier, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Burn that 1-800-675-888 number into your brain. That is a really important number for everyone, and undertaking those routine monitoring and surveillance of your livestock, so that if you see any signs that might be outside of what you expect to see, really do ask and phone call and call that emergency hotline. Otherwise, call your local vet. They're also a really good source. Thanks, Belinda. So I just want to reiterate, we all go to our accountants, we use our, we use all of these resources, but I think what we really need to start doing is using our local vets more in a biosecurity preparedness state. So they've got a lot of tips and tricks that and we'll be able to look at your risks and things like that as well. So have a think about how you might be able to use your local vet. Travis, I won't go into too much about this, but Travis said we do have the SA Emergency Animal Disease and Biosecurity web pages. The biosecurity web pages that we've got there really have got a lot of resources available. So have a browse of that in your own time. And finally, Travis did mention, and we'll skip to the next page, Belinda. There's an upcoming webinar, so you'll have to seek out this link, but it's really about some more practical actions, and we've got Samantha Allen again, but really looking at some of those biosecurity preparedness actions, practical actions for livestock. So that should hopefully expand on what I've presented today. So like I said, really can't stress enough that good biosecurity not only will save you now, but it's going to have benefits in the long run, regardless if an EAD comes here or not.
Thank you, Penny. That was fantastic. Some great practical tips in there. Now, we will move straight into Q&A now. Now, all of our panelists are still on the line. As mentioned earlier, we're going to prioritise those that we got on registration first. So the first question I'll direct to perhaps Travis Tobin and/or Minister Scriven. What's the risk percentage of foot and mouth disease entering Australia, and what processes are in place at the border to stop it entering?
Okay, I'll happy to go with that. So in terms of the percentage, the current estimate is it's 11.6% estimate of foot and mouth coming into Australia in the next 5 years. Now that is an increase from, I think it was 9.8% previously. So it's an increase because of the spread into Indonesia, but it remains at 11.6%. Now, in terms of what's being done at the borders, I think that's what, so was that a specific question? What's being done at the borders? Yes. You may well be aware of the extra $14 million that the federal government has put in to fight this threat. And that's included additional surveillance, both at airports and also in terms of things coming through the post. There's the sanitation mats that we mentioned earlier, and there's an increase in biosecurity officers. That's just some of the things that are being done on a federal level in terms of preventing it getting into the state. We're also very aware of the communications that need to happen. As I mentioned earlier, it needs to be balanced, so we don't, sensationalise it, but at the same time we do raise the awareness of people, and some of the things in regards to making sure there's clean clothes, clean shoes, all of that kind of thing is a big part of that. So that's some of the things that are being undertaken, but I'm sure Travis will have more to add as well.
Travis, anything you wanted to add?
No, I think the Minister's covered it well, Alistair. I think it's really just a recognition that, the risks are being monitored and the responses are escalating in line with the risks. So there's different things that are coming online. The only other one was, I think I mentioned in my little overview, MLA, so Meat and Livestock Australia have also invested money in Indonesia into feed loss sector capacity. So the Australian government is investing heavily in Indonesia about helping them get it under control, including vaccinations and capacity as well, because that's seen as one of the better ways of keeping both FMD and LSD out, is to help our northern neighbour get the disease under control in their own country. Thanks.
Thanks, Travis. Now, the next question is in regard to movement closures, which I'll perhaps direct to Dr. Carr. So what policies have been developed regarding movement closures, as well as infected properties, suspect properties, trace properties, and what impacts will these have on emergency service organisations?
Yeah, thank you for that. So there's a lot of documentation. The AusVet plan manuals have extensive guidance on what those movement controls and restrictions will be. As we talked about, the restrictions are really aimed at the livestock animals and the products and the vehicles that are at risk, which are ones that have been on an infected property, that we will make sure that they are decontaminated if they do need to come off. There are procedures in place that will allow the emergency services. So if we needed to get them into areas, it's not a total ban on movements through those areas. It's about controlling those movements and making sure that they're minimised and only the essential movements are done in those areas. So all of those things have been sort of thought through. We work through our state emergency arrangements as well. We actually work with all of those groups. They're all parts of that what we call the State Emergency Committee. And so we're actually doing a lot of that preparedness level stuff as well, for them to all think about what they might need and what their needs are, that to make sure that we've got that good connection.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Carr. And another one related to that, what would the radius be from a detection site in which all prone animals would be destroyed?
There is no radius as far as all animals being destroyed from a distance. The way it works, so for a disease like foot and mouth disease, we will have the what we call the IP, the infected property that we detect. And from there will be what we consider dangerous contact properties. And we'll assess those on how likely there is to have been spread to those. But given the type of disease it is, there may be a decision made to destroy the animals that are just directly in contact. From there, what we have is we have a restricted area. Now, that will be a minimum of 3 kilometres. It will depend on the individual situation. And we would look at the epidemiology, which is basically what is actually in that area, what are our concerns, what might be the weather events we've dealt with recently, all of these things. How long do we think this has been here will all influence how big that area might be. There may also be some natural barriers that are in place that actually might then limit the movement of disease. We take all of those things into consideration when we make the size of these areas. We also look at if there are 2 areas that are very close together, rather than having a little tiny patch of a short distance between 2 restricted areas, it makes much more sense to actually join those 2 up, because it's much easier to communicate rather than people thinking, hang on, I'm going in and out, and what does that mean? We want to be able to have really clear, consistent communication that we can apply. So often that's why we'll often start, and the other thing we'll often do is start a bit bigger. So while we say a minimum of 3, those restricted areas are about controlling disease. So sometimes we'll start a little bit bigger and then bring it back once we're assured that it actually is just contained to that one spot.
Great, thank you, Mary. We now have some questions regarding the foot and mouth disease vaccine, which I'll perhaps refer to Dr. Allen. So the first question relating to that is, why eradicate FMD when there is an effective vaccine?
Well, that is a good question. I think if we could get to the point where we're free of disease and, we don't need a vaccine, that's obviously ideal. But with foot and mouth disease, for Australia being a country that basically exports 75% of the animal products we produce, our export markets really rely on us being free of diseases like foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. So if an outbreak occurs, we'll initially lose market access. We'll use vaccination and all the other tools at our disposal to get rid of the disease and eradicate it, with the aim that we'll be able to restore the market access. So the vaccine is effective, but I think it would always be better if we could get back to the state where we're free of disease and resume trade and get back to normal.
Great, thanks, Dr. Allen. We'll jump through now to some questions regarding the upcoming rural shows. So I will direct these to both Dr. Carr and Dr. Allen. So firstly, are there any recommendations by PIRSA or Animal Health Australia that producers do not take their livestock to the Royal Adelaide Show or other country shows?
Sam, I'm happy to take this one if you like. So firstly, there is no disease outbreak in Australia. So at this point in time, we are not saying that there is a need to shut sale yards or shows, schools, zoos, all those things. There is no national call to shut those. There are border risk mitigations in place which have been elevated to help protect Australia. And we need to remember that we are going to be in for a long, sustainable response to these detections. They are not going to disappear overnight. They are likely to be here for quite a long time. So we need to make sure that we can work with a level of risk relating to these diseases so that we can actually keep functioning as an industry. We are working with the show. It comes down to individuals' decision whether they choose to go to the show or not. And that's always going to be the case. Individuals need to make their own decisions about risk. And there is a risk with moving animals at any point in time. So that's something that individuals need to consider and make their own decision over. However, what we are doing is working with the show to ensure that we've got good biosecurity messaging in place for both the attendees and those that are exhibiting. And it's the same messages that we've been hearing all day here. It's about good biosecurity. So wearing clean clothes and shoes to the show, not feeding the animals unless it's actually in an exhibit where you're expected to and they're providing you with that feed. As I've already mentioned, swill feeding, absolute no-no. About not handling animals unless you've got that permission. So reinforcing that with the show attendees. And unless, of course, it's actually an animal handling one, in which case washing hands and before and after is really important. And then the other one is it's the same message that we've been providing around the border. And really, if you've been overseas in the last 7 days, you shouldn't be going into the sheds where those animals are being housed and having that close contact. Enjoy the outdoors. You've got your clean shoes and clothes on. So we'll also be present at the show. We'll be having a stand at the show where there'll be information and people can come and ask us questions about that as well. But we will be doing some promotions in conjunction with the show leading up to that. And it's the same that's been taken with the shows around the country. We've got the ECA starting, I believe, on Saturday. And then we've got the Melbourne show coming up as well. And that's a consistent response across all of the different states and territories around having these shows.
Great, thank you, Dr. Carr. Now, a couple of quick on-farm biosecurity questions for Penny. So firstly, how long should brought in stock be quarantined before mixing with other herds or mobs?
So ideally it would be about 21 to 28 days would be probably where the industry sits around these, but there obviously are some nuances to some of the diseases such as foot rot or yonis that you need to be aware of. So, it does vary, but that period is a really good indication of as long as you're looking at those livestock and making sure that you've done all the right treatments and things like that, that's probably a fair time frame.
Great. And another one quickly, they're looking to implement some foot and vehicle disinfectant baths. Yep. Is there any clear advice as to the correct disinfectant to be using in that regard? Yeah,
so there is some advice, and there is the decontamination OSVAT plan manual that you could go and refer to. Commonly, people are using that citric acid. There's also some products on the market like Virkon that do cover all of these diseases, and so those would be the products. There's also some talk about sodium hydroxide, which can be used at 1%. However, that one can be a little bit more corrosive. So it's up to you how you choose to do that.
Great, thanks, Penny. I will just jump to a couple of questions we've got live tonight. So the first one is about what's in place for seaports, particularly in the southeast. There's the Port of Portland, where there's obviously a lot of ships coming in and out, and the crews getting off and going to town for supplies, etc. Yeah, I guess Minister, that might be one for you in terms of what's actually in place for those kind of workers getting off export ships.
I might actually invite Nathan to respond to that one.
So any international arrival port has Commonwealth Government officers on arrival. There's a maritime arrival system that requires vessels to report before they enter the port, according to where they've been, what they're carrying, the disease status of any of their staff on board and those sorts of things. And then they're met on arrival by a biosecurity officer who will undertake their normal screening checks and make sure that there is nothing on board that could otherwise pose a risk to Australia. That is in place at all times and remains to be the case. There's adequate defence in this regard as well.
Thanks, Nathan. And by the way, to our viewers tonight, Nathan Rhodes is the Executive Director of Biosecurity SA. He's thankfully joined us tonight. Nathan, this might be one for you as well, relating to public road corridors that traverse properties, such as those in the pastoral area. How can producers monitor or control such movement, especially on the large runs in the north?
Roads in pastoral areas.
Well, it's always a difficult issue when you've got public access roads into those areas. What we do is encourage that communication around the fact that people that are using those public roads, and they are a public road, should stick to the public roads, and it's all the biosecurity messaging that goes with it around, making sure that what you take in, you take out with you, don't leave your waste behind, staying to the designated tracks. It's the same with walking trails as well. It's around having that messaging and the signs up and reminding people that they need to stay within those, the areas that are actually allocated as the public access.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. We'll go to one more question quickly, as it's quite pertinent. So, how well described is the feral susceptible species in SA, and how would PIRSA approach controlling FMD spread via feral species?
I can take it. Yeah, so we do have, through our Landscape Act, the requirement to report those feral species in. So we do have a good understanding of them, both of feral pigs and feral deer. And as far as response goes to those animals, there is an AusVet plan wild animal response strategy, but basically it is really tailored in a response to look at what are the potential risks of those animals and what is the best way to manage that risk. And it may not be going in and disturbing those animals because we don't want to scatter them or to move them further afield. So they've actually looked a lot. There was a lot of work done around feral pigs with African swine fever and looking at what had been used overseas with that as well, where they have had to control these diseases. And what they do is they actually try to attract them to a central point and hold them there, and then actually do the culling around that to try and create a buffer zone around them and then destroy the feral animals that are actually the infected ones. But they want to keep them where they are rather than scattering them. So there are response strategies. What we do recommend is that all producers undertake feral animal management on their properties. The less feral animals we have, then that does help to lower the risk that what we need to do and how we need to respond within an emergency response situation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Carr. Look, we have run over time, so that's probably about all the questions we've got time for this evening. But please don't stress if we haven't got to your question. We will be collating all the outstanding questions and responding, and we'll set up a frequently asked questions page on the Livestock SA website in the coming days. As well as that, the recording of tonight's webinar will be on Livestock SA's YouTube channel and resources as well on the Livestock SA website again in the coming days. So just to wrap up, I'd like to thank you all, our viewers, for joining. We hope you've answered some of your questions and allayed some of the concerns you might have. Huge thanks to Minister Scriven, to Dr. Samantha Allen, to Dr. Carr, as well as to Travis Tobin and Penny Keynes from Livestock SA for their insights tonight and their expertise. It's been fantastic. I'm Alistair Lawson. Hope you have a great evening, and yes, we'll be in touch. Thank you.